Chapter 1. The stone of the sacrificial altar was freezing, sapping the last bits of warmth from Valka's spine. She didn't thrash against the heavy iron cuffs binding her wrists and ankles. There was no point. "Are we getting this over with?" she asked. Her voice was entirely too steady for a woman about to die. "The rock is cold." Above her stood Vaelith, the Immortal Lord of the Underrealm, the god who traded his humanity for a crown of ash 1,000 years ago. He didn't blink. His eyes were pools of endless, hollow black. No anger, no malice, just a chilling, absolute void. "It is a necessity," Vaelith said. His voice held no inflection, sounding like ancient stones grinding together in the dark. "Your life fuels the rift. It keeps the monsters at bay. It is nothing personal." "Good to know," Valka muttered, her jaw tightening. "I'll make sure to put that on my tombstone. Killed for a good cause. Nothing personal." Vaelith did not react to the sarcasm. He didn't react to anything. He simply raised his right hand. He carried no ceremonial dagger. He didn't need one. His fingernails elongated into sharp obsidian claws, hovering right above the center of her chest. "Close your eyes," he ordered. "No." Valka stared right back into the abyss of his gaze. "If you're going to take my life, you're going to look me in the eye while you do it." For a fraction of a second, his hand paused. Then he drove it down. He didn't plunge deep. The razor-sharp tip of his index claw merely broke her skin, pressing hard against her sternum. A sharp, breathless gasp left Valka's lips. A thin line of red welled up beneath his hand. But the scream that echoed through the silent cavern didn't come from her. Vaelith violently jerked his hand back as if he had touched burning iron. He staggered backward, his massive frame folding in half. He hit the stone floor, his knees cracking against the granite. Valka froze, her breath caught in her throat. The immortal god was on the ground. He had both arms wrapped tightly around his own torso, his fingers digging into his dark robes right over his heart. He was choking on air, pulling in ragged, jagged gasps that echoed off the damp walls. Lord Vaelith, Kor, the one-armed prison guard standing in the shadows, rushed forward. "Get back!" Vaelith roared. The command was meant to be terrifying, but his voice cracked. It splintered into something raw and entirely ungodly. He shoved Kor away blindly, his entire body trembling. Valka watched from the altar, utterly bewildered. The sting in her chest was sharp but manageable, just a surface wound. Yet the invincible deity before her was curled over, acting as though a blade had been twisted into his very soul. Vaelith stared at his own hands. They were shaking. He clenched his fists, trying to force his muscles to obey, but the tremors only worsened. A cold, clammy sensation broke out across his pale forehead. Sweat. He touched his own face, staring at the moisture on his fingertips in absolute horror. He hadn't sweat in a millennium. He hadn't felt cold, or heat, or pain. The sudden sensory overload felt like acid pouring directly into his brain. His stomach lurched violently. "What?" Vaelith choked out, his chest heaving. "What is this?" Valka frowned, lifting her head slightly to look down at him. The terrifying executioner was having a panic attack on her floor. The tension in the room suddenly shifted from life-or-death dread to a bizarre, uncomfortable awkwardness. "Are you?" Valka hesitated, the absurdity of the situation catching up to her. "Do you need a towel?" Vaelith's head snapped up. His black eyes were wide, frantic, completely stripped of their usual dead calm. He looked at her not like a sacrifice, but like a terrifying, incomprehensible threat. "I didn't do anything," Valka defended herself quickly, gesturing to the heavy iron chains with her chin. "I'm strapped to a rock, in case you forgot." Vaelith forced himself up. His movements were clumsy, uncoordinated. The graceful, lethal predator was gone, replaced by a man stumbling in his own skin. He lunged toward her. Valka braced for the final blow. Instead, Vaelith grabbed the thick iron chain binding her right wrist. With a sharp, desperate yank, the metal shattered into pieces. He moved to her left wrist, then her ankles, breaking the bindings with violent, erratic force. He was setting her free. Valka sat up slowly, rubbing her bruised wrists, her eyes darting between the broken chains and the god standing before her. Vaelith backed away immediately. He put 10 feet of distance between them in a heartbeat, his hand still gripping his own chest as if trying to hold his ribcage together. He looked entirely cornered. "Don't move," he warned, his chest rising and falling in erratic human rhythms. You just untied me, Valka pointed out, sliding her feet off the edge of the cold stone. Are we canceling the apocalypse, or did you just lose your nerve? Silence. Vaelith took another step back, his eyes fixed firmly on the small, bleeding scratch on her chest. Every time she breathed, every time her heart pumped blood through that tiny wound, an identical phantom ache pulsed in his own chest. It was agonizing, it was nauseating, it was undeniably real. He looked up, locking eyes with her. The absolute authority of the Underrealm was completely gone, replaced by the naked, raw fear of a man realizing he was no longer invincible. What did you do to my heartbeat? Vaelith demanded, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Chapter 2. The heavy oak doors of the high tower slammed shut. Vaelith dropped the iron deadbolt into place with a resounding clang, leaning his forehead against the freezing wood. His chest was still heaving. Valka stood in the center of the massive, dimly lit chamber. It didn't look like a bedroom. There were no tapestries, no hearth, no signs of life. It looked like a meticulously kept tomb. So, Valka broke the suffocating silence. Are you going to explain why we just ran away from your own guards? Or should I just bleed on your floor until you figure it out? Vaelith turned. His dark eyes were still wide, hyper-focused on the thin line of red staining the collar of her coarse tunic. Every time she shifted, the fabric pulled at the shallow cut he had given her, and every time it pulled, a sharp, annoying sting flared right in the center of his own chest. I am not running, he ground out, though his voice lacked its usual earth-shattering authority. I am containing an anomaly. Right, you're containing me in your bedroom. The side door creaked open before Vaelith could snap a reply. A tall woman stepped in, carrying a bundle of fresh linens. She had the pointed ears of a fey half-breed and an expression that suggested she was entirely unimpressed by the Lord of the Underrealm. This was Tilda. She paused, looking from Vaelith, who was clutching his chest, to Valka, who was bleeding and handcuffed to absolutely nothing. Well, Tilda drawled, tossing a roll of white bandages onto the stone table. This is new. You brought the sacrifice home. How domestic, Lord Vaelith. Should I go warm up some soup, or are you going to finish killing her on the rug? Watch your tone, Tilda, Vaelith hissed. I'm just asking for a schedule. Tilda crossed her arms. You look pale. Gods aren't supposed to look pale. Bandage her up before you both ruin the floorboards. She didn't wait for a dismissal. She turned on her heel and walked out, letting the door click shut behind her. Valka stared at the door, then at Vaelith. Does everyone talk to you like that? Sit, he ordered, ignoring her question. He pointed to the edge of the massive, unmade bed. Valka didn't argue. She sat down, wincing slightly as the movement tugged at her cut. Vaelith flinched. His hand twitched toward his own sternum. He grabbed the bandages Tilda had left and crossed the room, stopping right in front of her. He towered over her, a being of absolute terrifying power, yet his hands large, heavily veined, and tipped with dark nails were hesitating. He had not touched a wound in 1,000 years. He didn't get injured. He didn't heal others. Move your collar, he muttered. Valka pulled the fabric down. Vaelith pressed the pad of the bandage against the cut. His hand was too large, his movements too rigid. He pressed too hard. Ow! Valka hissed, jerking back. Ah, Vaelith cursed, dropping the bandage as he stumbled a step backward, clutching his own chest. The sharp sting had echoed violently through his own nervous system. They stared at each other, both breathing heavily. You did that on purpose, Vaelith accused, his voice tight. I didn't do anything, Valka snapped, clutching her tunic. You have the hands of a stone golem. You're pressing right into the wound. It is a scratch. Humans are impossibly fragile. Then let me do it myself. She reached for the roll. No. He swatted her hand away, picking up the bandage again. Sit still. He stepped back into her space. This time, he didn't use his whole hand. He carefully, painstakingly used 2 fingers to press the cloth against her skin. He was so close Valka could see the unnatural, void-like black of his irises. But there was something else there now. A frantic, vibrating energy. He was holding his breath, waiting for the pain to hit him. When it didn't, his jaw relaxed. They sat on the floor an hour later, leaning against the cold stone wall. Tilda had returned, silently leaving a wooden plate with 2 chunks of stale bread and a cup of water. Valka took a bite of the bread. It was dry, tasting faintly of ash. She chewed slowly, her stomach rumbling. Beside her, Vaelith suddenly groaned, pressing a hand to his stomach. What is that? What? That? He swallowed hard, looking genuinely distressed. That gnawing sensation, like my insides are trying to consume themselves. Valka paused, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. That's called hunger. Vaelith stared at her in utter horror. Hunger. Yes, it happens when you don't eat. She broke the bread in half and held a piece out to him. Here, take it. Before you pass out and make me feel it. He looked at the bread as if it were poison. Cautiously, he took it, chewing with a grimace. The silence stretched. It wasn't the silence of a predator and prey anymore. It was the deeply uncomfortable, grounding silence of two people trapped in a bizarre situation. Midnight fell over the tower. Valka eventually crawled into the massive bed, too exhausted to care about the danger anymore. She fell asleep the moment her head hit the pillow. Vaelith remained in the heavy oak chair across the room, watching her. He didn't sleep. He didn't need to. Or so he thought. Hours later, the fire in the hearth died down to embers. The temperature in the stone room plummeted. Vaelith shifted in the chair. His skin felt strange, biting, tight. A violent, involuntary tremor racked his broad shoulders. His teeth clicked together. He stood up, bewildered. He looked at his hands. They were pale, the dark veins prominent. He rubbed his arms, but the strange, biting sensation didn't stop. It felt like tiny needles piercing his flesh. Cold. He was freezing. Panic gripped him. He didn't know how to stop it. He looked around the dark room, his instincts entirely stripped away, leaving only a primal human urge to survive. To find warmth, his eyes landed on the bed. Without thinking, Vaelith crossed the room. He didn't wake her. He carefully lifted the heavy fur blanket and slid into the bed behind her. Valka was radiating heat. The immortal god, the terror of the underrealm, let out a shaky breath and curled his massive frame against her back. He pulled the blanket up to his chin, completely abandoning his divinity just to stop the shivering. Chapter 3. A massive crash shook the stone walls of the tower. Valka jolted awake, throwing off the heavy fur blanket. The space beside her was empty, but the sheets were still warm. Vaelith was already on his feet near the heavy oak door. He wasn't moving like a god anymore. He stumbled, his hand braced against the wall as if the sudden movement had made him dizzy. What was that? Valka demanded, her heart hammering against her ribs. Across the room, Vaelith let out a sharp hiss. He gripped his own chest, his knuckles turning white. He was feeling her panic. Every rapid beat of her heart felt like a drum pounding against his skull. Calm down, Vaelith gritted out, his breath ragged. You are distracting me. Someone is breaking down the door, and you want me to calm down? It is not the door. It is the courtyard gates. Vaelith pushed himself off the wall, his dark eyes narrowing. Stay here. Do not move. Do not panic. He turned and strode out, leaving the heavy door slightly ajar. Valka didn't listen. The moment his footsteps faded down the spiral staircase, she rushed to the narrow, arched window and looked down into the muddy courtyard. There was no army, no siege weapons, just one man. Priest Othos stood alone in the freezing rain. The supreme leader of the human church wore no armor. His white robes were soaked, clinging to his frail, aged frame. The heavy courtyard doors swung open. Vaelith stepped out into the storm. Valka held her breath. She expected the god of the underrealm to raise a hand and banish the priest to ash. She expected a display of terrifying, world-ending magic. Instead, Vaelith just stood there. He looked rigid, uncomfortable. Othos didn't raise his hands to cast a spell. He didn't shout a battle cry. The old priest simply dropped his heavy iron staff into the mud. Then, he fell to his knees. Look at you, Othos cried out. His voice was raw, echoing up the stone walls. It wasn't the voice of a holy leader confronting a demon. It was the voice of a broken, exhausted man. Go home, Othos, Vaelith said. His voice carried, but the terrifying, hollow echo of the immortal was gone. He sounded tired. You are shivering, Vaelith, Othos screamed, tears mixing with the rain on his wrinkled face. I can see you shivering. A god does not feel the cold. Vaelith flinched. Up in the tower, Valka's breath hitched. She watched Vaelith's hand twitch toward his chest again. He is feeling my fear, she realized with a sickening jolt. I am handicapping him just by standing here. She is a tumor, brother, Othos begged, pressing his forehead into the mud. She is a disease. Let me kill her, please, before the rift shatters, before the ancient ones tear down the wall and eat our children. Valka stepped back from the window. The cold stone of the wall bit into her spine. Brother. The high priest was his brother. Othos wasn't a villain trying to usurp power. He was an old man terrified for the world. He was terrified for Vaelith. I cannot let you touch her, Vaelith replied below. His voice was quieter now, strained. The bond is inverted. If she dies, I do not know what will happen to me. Then let me try, Othos sobbed. I will take the sin. Let me cut the rot out of you. Valka covered her mouth, her stomach violently twisting. The absolute truth hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't a tragic heroine. She wasn't a prisoner of war. She was a liability. The very fact that she was breathing was turning an invincible guardian into a weak, shivering man. The heavy oak door of the bedroom creaked open. Valka spun around. Kor stood in the doorway. The one-armed prison guard didn't look angry. He looked completely apathetic. He walked to the stone table and dropped an object onto the wood. It hit with a heavy, dull thud. It was a jagged, fist-sized crystal. The bloodstone. It pulsed with a faint, sickly red light. They pulled your life anchor from the sacrificial altar, Kor said flatly. Valka stared at the glowing stone, then at the guard. Why are you showing me this? Kor crossed his remaining arm over his chest, gesturing toward the window with his chin. The old man down there is right. You're dragging the Lord down into the dirt. A god shouldn't flinch because a human gets a paper cut. I didn't ask for this bond, Valka snapped, her voice trembling. Doesn't matter. Kor looked her dead in the eye. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered reality. That stone ties your physical form to the magic of the rift. You crush it, the magic shatters, and you disappear. No blood, no mess. Valka stared at the red crystal. The rhythmic pulsing looked exactly like a heartbeat. Do it, Kor said, stepping back into the shadows. Crush it, give him his godhood back. Or go out there and watch a frail old man beat the Lord of the Underrealm to death because you're too scared to let go. Kor turned and walked out, leaving the door wide open. Valka was left completely alone with the glowing stone, while the desperate sobs of the priest echoed from the courtyard below. Chapter 4. Valka stared at the glowing bloodstone on the table. Outside the window, the sickening crack of heavy iron striking bone echoed up the tower walls. Vaelith didn't cry out. He didn't defend himself. He just took the beating. Crush it, Kor's flat voice echoed in her mind. Give him his godhood back. She grabbed the jagged crystal. It was unnaturally warm, pulsing against her palm like a trapped bird. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the void that would follow. She just wanted the terrible sound of Vaelith being beaten to stop. Valka raised the stone and slammed it down onto the granite table. It didn't break. Down in the courtyard, Priest Othos roared, "Fight back, brother! Use your power!" Valka gripped the stone with both hands. She raised it higher. She brought it down with every ounce of strength she possessed. Crack. The red crystal shattered into jagged, glowing shards. Instantly, the air in the room vanished. A shockwave of blinding agony ripped through Valka's chest. It wasn't a physical wound. It felt like a massive, invisible hand had just reached into her ribcage and crushed her lungs. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for air that wasn't there. Down in the mud, Vaelith dropped. He didn't just stumble. He hit the ground hard, his massive frame convulsing violently as the exact same agonizing shockwave tore through his chest. Othos froze, his iron staff raised midair. Then, the memories hit. They didn't belong to Valka. They crashed into her mind like a collapsing dam, violent and suffocating. A dark cavern. A stone altar. 1,000 years ago, Vaelith stood in the dark. He wasn't a god yet. He was a man, screaming in grief, clutching a glowing ethereal mass of pure light that he had just ripped from his own chest. Take it, the memory Vaelith begged the shadows, tears streaming down his face. Take the pain, take the fear, take the love. I don't want to feel it anymore. The shadows took the light. They buried it deep in the earth. And over 1,000 years, the earth grew flesh around that buried light. It gave it a heartbeat. It gave it a name. Valka. She wasn't a sacrifice chosen by the priests. She was the discarded, broken pieces of his human soul wrapped in mortal skin. Valka opened her eyes, choking on a sob. The heavy oak door of the bedroom suddenly blew off its hinges. The wood splintered into dust. Vaelith stood in the doorway. He was covered in mud. He was gasping for air. His dark robes were soaked, clinging to a body that was shivering violently. But it was his eyes that made Valka's breath stop. The endless, terrifying void of black was gone. They were brown, piercing, desperate, intensely human brown. He didn't look at her like a god looking at a mortal. He looked at her like a starving man looking at his only salvation. "You broke the stone," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, entirely devoid of its divine echo. Valka pressed her back against the cold wall, terrified of the raw emotion radiating from him. "I know what I am. I saw it." Vaelith crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He didn't stop until his knees hit the floor right in front of her. He reached out. His hands were trembling. "Don't," Valka pleaded, her voice cracking. She tried to pull away. "If you complete this bond, the rift falls. The monsters get in. You lose your immortality." "I don't care," Vaelith rasped. He grabbed her wrists, pinning them gently but firmly. He pressed his palm flat against her chest, right over her racing heart. As he did, the jagged edge of a shattered crystal piece on the floor sliced deep into his knee. Valka gasped. Vaelith didn't pull away. He just looked down. Thick, bright red blood dripped from his torn flesh onto the gray stone. Not the silver, glowing ichor of a deity. The crimson, fragile blood of a mortal man. Chapter 5. The freezing rain of the rotting forest felt like needles. Valka dragged herself through the knee-deep mud, her lungs burning. Ahead of her, the god of the Underrealm was falling apart. Vaelith stumbled. His massive shoulder slammed against the trunk of a dead oak tree. He didn't bounce back. He just leaned heavily against the rotting bark, his chest heaving as if he had just fought a war. "Keep moving," Vaelith ordered. His voice was a harsh, wet rasp. "You can barely stand." Valka shot back, wiping thick, cold mud from her face. "I am fine." He pushed off the tree. He took 2 steps and immediately collapsed to his knees. Valka rushed forward, grabbing his arm to pull him up. The moment her bare skin touched his wrist, she recoiled. He wasn't just warm, he was burning. "You're on fire," she said, her eyes widening. Vaelith looked at his shaking hands. "It is the cold. The rain is freezing, but my skin is boiling. The magic. It is tearing itself apart trying to heal me, but there is nothing left to draw from." "It's not magic," Valka said, dropping to her knees in the mud beside him. "It's a fever. Your body is fighting an infection from the cold." "A fever," he repeated the word with absolute disgust. He closed his eyes, a violent shiver racking his broad shoulders. "This is pathetic. Human bodies are entirely flawed. How do you survive like this?" "We endure." Valka grabbed the heavy fabric of his soaked cloak. "Come on. We need cover. You're going to freeze to death before the monsters even get a chance to eat us." She hauled him up. It was a miserable, ugly struggle. There was no divine grace left in him. Vaelith was dead weight, his bones heavy, his breathing ragged. He sneezed a jarring, sudden sound that made him freeze in absolute shock, staring at her as if his own body had betrayed him. "Don't panic," Valka muttered, trying not to roll her eyes despite the terrifying situation. "It's just a sneeze. Keep walking." They found the hollowed-out base of a massive dead redwood. It wasn't a romantic crystal cave. It smelled of decay and wet earth. Mud seeped through the roots. Vaelith practically fell into the hollow. He curled into himself, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Valka stood at the edge, shivering violently herself. She looked at the man on the dirt. The terrifying alpha who was supposed to rule the world was currently curled in a ball, defeated by a rainstorm. "If you die out here, Athos is going to kill me anyway," she said quietly. Vaelith didn't answer. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Valka cursed under her breath. She crawled into the cramped hollow. There was no room to keep her distance. She pressed her back against the damp wood and pulled Vaelith by the shoulders, dragging his massive, heavy frame against her own. He flinched. "Stop moving," she snapped, wrapping her arms around his trembling chest. She pulled the driest part of his cloak over them both. "I'm freezing too. Share the heat." For a moment he went entirely rigid. The proximity was suffocating. She could feel his erratic, racing heartbeat against her ribs. She could smell the rain, the mud, and the sharp, masculine scent of him no longer masked by cold magic, but raw and overwhelming. Slowly, the violent tremors racking his body began to ease. Vaelith exhaled a long, shaky breath. He didn't pull away. Instead, he completely surrendered to the exhaustion. His heavy head dropped onto her shoulder, his face buried into the crook of her neck. "You are so small," he mumbled against her skin, his voice thick with fever. "But you are warm. You have bony elbows," Valka shot back, though her grip on his waist tightened. "Don't get used to it. I missed you." The words slipped out of him before he could stop them. They hung in the damp air, heavy and raw. He wasn't talking to a woman he just met. He was talking to his own soul, the missing piece he had cut out a millennium ago. Valka swallowed hard, her throat tight. She didn't have an answer for that. She didn't know how to comfort a god she had unknowingly broken. Minutes bled into an hour. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle. Vaelith's breathing finally evened out. The absolute exhaustion of mortality had dragged him into a deep, heavy sleep. Valka leaned her head back against the wood, her eyelids drooping. They were safe for now. The forest was quiet. Snap. The sound of a breaking twig cut through the silence like a knife. Valka's eyes flew open. A shadow fell over the opening of the hollow root. Priest Othos stood in the mud, his white robe stained black, staring down at them. He wasn't holding his iron staff. He was holding a small, dark glass vial. Chapter 6. Othos stood at the edge of the hollow. The rain dripped heavily from his ruined white robes. He didn't look like a high priest. He looked like a gravedigger. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply held up a small, dark glass vial. "Nightshade and bitter root," Othos said softly. The exhaustion in his voice was heavier than the storm. "It won't hurt. You will just fall asleep." Valka froze, her arms still wrapped tightly around Vaelith's shivering body. "You tracked us." "I tracked his fading magic. It leaves a trail of dying earth." Othos took a step closer, his eyes fixed on his brother. "Look at him, Valka." Valka didn't want to look, but she did. Vaelith's face was ashen. His lips were tinted blue. The god who held the underrealm together was trembling like a frightened child in the mud. "He is dying," Othos stated bluntly. "Immortality is not a switch you can just turn on and off. His body has not aged in a millennium, but time is catching up. If he stays bound to you, his mortal heart will give out before morning." "He chose to break the chains," Valka argued, her voice shaking. "He didn't choose anything. He is intoxicated by emotions he hasn't felt in 1,000 years. Othos snapped, his composure cracking. "He is drowning in you." A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the hollow. Othos dropped to his knees in the mud, the supreme leader of the church, bowing to a filthy, terrified woman. "The rift is cracking," Othos whispered, tears spilling down his wrinkled cheeks. "I can hear the Ancient Ones clawing at the barrier. Millions of innocent people will be slaughtered tomorrow if he does not return to the altar." He extended his trembling hand, offering the black vial. "Drink it, please. Erase yourself, give him the void back." Valka stared at the vial. She was just a woman. She never asked to be the discarded humanity of a god. She never asked to hold the fate of the world in her chest. She looked down at Vaelith. He shifted in his feverish sleep, burying his face deeper into her shoulder to seek warmth. It was the most vulnerable, beautiful thing she had ever seen, but it was selfish. "I am a tumor," she thought, Kor's harsh words ringing in her ears. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Valka reached out. Her fingers brushed against Othos's cold skin. She took the glass vial. "Thank you," Othos choked out, bowing his head. Valka pulled the cork. The bitter scent of poison stung her nose. She raised it to her lips. She closed her eyes, ready for the dark. A hand slammed over her wrist. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a desperate, crushing grip that bruised her skin. Valka gasped, her eyes snapping open. Vaelith was awake. His brown eyes were bloodshot, bright with fever, but fiercely lucid. He didn't roar. He didn't summon magic. He simply stared at her, his breathing ragged and shallow. "Don't," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. He pushed her hand away. The vial slipped from her grasp, shattering against a tree root. The dark liquid seeped uselessly into the mud. "Vaelith, you are dying," Othos screamed, scrambling forward. Vaelith ignored his brother. He kept his burning gaze locked entirely on Valka. His hand slid from her wrist, his feverish fingers tangling into her muddy hair. "Don't drink it," Vaelith breathed, his chest heaving against hers. "I am cold. I am hurting. I am so terribly hungry. He pulled her an inch closer, resting his burning forehead against hers. And I never want to go back to that empty dark again. Chapter 7. Othos stared at the broken glass in the mud. The dark liquid seeped into the earth, taking the world's last hope with it. He looked up. His brother, the terrifying immortal who had guarded humanity for a millennium, was clutching a mortal woman like a lifeline. He was shivering. He was weak. "You fool!" Othos breathed. His voice trembled with a terrifying mix of grief and absolute rage. "You selfish, arrogant fool! Leave us, Othos," Vaelith commanded. But there was no divine authority left in his tone. His voice broke. It was a hoarse, feverish rasp. "Millions will die," Othos screamed, his face twisting in agony. He grabbed the heavy iron staff he had dropped earlier. "If you won't cut the rod out, I will do it for you." Othos lunged. He didn't aim for Vaelith. He swung the heavy iron rod directly at Valka's head. Valka couldn't move. The cramped hollow offered no room to dodge. She braced for the crushing impact. It never came. A massive shadow eclipsed her vision. Vaelith didn't raise a wall of impenetrable dark magic. He didn't banish Othos to ash. Instead, he threw his own fever-ravaged body over hers. Crack. The sickening sound of heavy iron striking bone echoed through the damp forest. Vaelith grunted violently. His entire body jolted against hers, but he didn't yield an inch. He wrapped his arms around her head, burying her face into his chest to completely shield her from the assault. "Vaelith," Valka screamed, her voice muffled against his wet cloak. "Use your power. Push him back." "No," Vaelith gritted out, his jaw clenched in agony. "He's going to kill you." The second strike folded Vaelith forward with a violent jolt. He choked, a sharp, wet cough racking his chest as his fingers slipped in the freezing mud, struggling to maintain his hold. Valka tasted copper in the air. Othos's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the staff. He looked sick, tears mixing with the rain as the iron connected with his brother's spine. "If I summon the void, I have to let you go," Vaelith gasped, his heavy, rapid breaths fanning across her hair. "The magic requires absolute emptiness. I have to sever the bond." "Then do it," she sobbed, terrified by the sheer weight of him pressing down on her. "I refuse," Vaelith rasped, tightening his trembling grip around her as if letting go would kill him. Vaelith was terrified. Not of the iron staff, not even of dying. Of the numbness waiting behind the void. He chose the physical agony. He chose her. Othos swung again. "Let her go!" the priest roared, weeping openly as he beat his own brother. "Never," Vaelith said, the word cracking apart under the weight of pain. A devastating blow landed squarely on the back of Vaelith's neck. The man went completely still. His arms lost their strength. His heavy frame collapsed, dead weight pinning Valka firmly against the rotting roots of the tree. He didn't make a sound. His breathing turned into a shallow, ragged wheeze. "No, no, no!" Valka panicked, struggling violently beneath him. She pushed against his broad shoulders, but she couldn't lift him. "Vaelith, look at me!" His brown eyes fluttered half open. They were unfocused, glazed with pain, fever, and rapidly blurring vision. Othos stepped over them. The old priest towered at the edge of the hollow. His white robes were entirely ruined with black mud. Tears streamed freely down his wrinkled face as he looked at the defeated man in the dirt. Slowly, Othos raised the heavy iron staff high above his head, the metal glinting in the pale rain. He aimed the killing blow straight at the space between Valka's eyes. "Forgive me, brother," Othos sobbed. "I am saving the world." Chapter 8. Othos brought the heavy iron staff down. Valka didn't close her eyes. She didn't scream. In a split second, she twisted her body, slipping out from under Vaelith's dead weight. She didn't scramble away to save herself. She threw herself directly over Vaelith's face, shielding him just as he had shielded her. The iron staff stopped an inch from her spine. Othos froze, his hands violently shaking. "Move, Valka, move!" "No!" Valka screamed, her voice tearing her throat. She grabbed the lapels of Vaelith's ruined cloak, hauling his heavy, unconscious upper body against her chest. "He is already gone," Othos wept, dropping to his knees in the mud. "You have killed us all. The wall is going to fall." Valka ignored the priest. She looked down at the Lord of the Underrealm. His breathing had stopped. His skin was freezing again, but it wasn't the cold of immortal magic. It was the terrifying, permanent cold of a dying mortal. "Don't you dare leave me," Valka whispered fiercely. She gripped his face, her thumbs pressing into his pale, muddy cheeks. "You said you didn't want to go back to the dark. Then stay here." She didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for a miracle. Valka leaned down and slammed her mouth against his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, violent collision of two severed halves. It tasted of rain, copper, and absolute terror. She bit down on his lower lip, forcing a sharp sting of pain, pouring every ounce of her own racing heartbeat into his silent chest. "Claim me," she prayed to a god who was dying in her arms. "Take it back." For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, Vaelith's massive hands suddenly clamped onto her waist. His grip was crushing. A guttural, tearing groan ripped from his throat, vibrating against her lips. A shockwave of pure, blinding force exploded from their connected bodies. Othos was thrown backward into the mud. The rotting trees around them violently splintered. The rain stopped falling, suspended in midair by the sheer gravity of what was happening. Vaelith dragged Valka closer, burying his hands in her wet hair, kissing her back with a starving, possessive ferocity. It was the mating. 1,000 years of suppressed rage, sorrow, joy, and agonizing love slammed directly back into Vaelith's mind all at once. The emotional overload was catastrophic. He shook violently against her, completely overwhelmed by the sensory explosion of finally, truly being alive. The empty void inside his chest vanished. His soul locked into place. He broke the kiss, gasping for air as if he had been drowning for a millennium. He pressed Valka's head against his chest, wrapping his arms around her in an unbreakable iron grip. Underneath her ear, Valka heard it. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. It wasn't a hollow echo anymore. It was a strong, steady, entirely human heartbeat. "Vaelith," Valka breathed, clinging to him. He didn't speak. He just held her tighter, burying his face in the crook of her neck, shaking with the overwhelming weight of his restored humanity. He was whole. But a terrible sound cut through the forest. Crack. It sounded like a glacier snapping in half. It didn't come from the woods. It came from above. Valka slowly looked up. The dark, impenetrable magical barrier that covered the sky of the Underrealm was splintering. Massive, glowing fissures spider-webbed across the heavens. The magic that was tied to Vaelith's absolute lack of humanity was rapidly decaying, starved of its power source. With a deafening roar, the sky shattered like a mirror. Shards of pure, useless magic rained down upon the world, fading into dust before they hit the ground. And then, the screaming began. It wasn't human. It was a chorus of ancient, guttural, terrifying roars echoing from the horizon. The monsters that had been locked out for 1,000 years were finally crossing the threshold. Othos sat in the mud, staring at the broken sky. The old priest dropped his iron staff. He didn't cry out in anger anymore. He just covered his face with his trembling, dirt-stained hands. "The rift is open," Othos whispered into the dark. "The world is done." Chapter 9. The roars from the horizon didn't stop. They carried over the rotting forest, thick and ancient, vibrating through the damp earth. Othos was still kneeling in the mud. He didn't look at the shattered sky anymore. He stared blankly at the dirt, a hollow shell of a man waiting for the end. Vaelith pushed himself up. He didn't rise with the weightless grace of a deity. He moved slowly, his joints popped, his breath was visible in the cold air, coming in short, harsh gasps. He leaned heavily against the splintered trunk of a dead oak to steady himself, his muscles trembling under his own weight. He looked down at his hands. They were caked in mud and dried blood. His blood. Valka stayed on her knees watching him. She didn't say a word. She just waited. Vaelith turned his head. The endless void in his eyes was gone completely. The brown irises were bloodshot, exhausted, and unmistakably human. He walked over to Othos. The high priest didn't flinch. Vaelith bent down. He didn't reach for his brother's throat. He reached into the mud and picked up the heavy iron staff. Then, he offered his empty hand to Valka. She took it. His skin was rough, warm, and shaking slightly from the cold. He pulled her to her feet, keeping her close against his side. "Get up, Othos," Vaelith said. His voice was hoarse. Othos slowly raised his head. He looked at the falling ash, then at his brother. "You doomed them. All of them. The barrier is gone." Vaelith agreed quietly. He didn't defend himself. He didn't apologize. He just stated the undeniable truth. It is not coming back. What do we do? Athos choked out, the despair breaking his voice completely. Vaelith wiped a streak of dark mud from his own jaw. You go back to the city. You ring the church bells. You call the militia. Athos stared at him in disbelief. Swords? Against the ancient ones? We will be slaughtered. Then we fight until we are slaughtered, Vaelith said. He tightened his grip on the iron staff. Like men. He didn't wait for the priest's response. Vaelith turned and guided Valka away from the clearing, stepping under the dense canopy of the remaining trees. The rain had stopped. Dust from the shattered barrier drifted down through the branches like gray snow. They found a dry alcove beneath a massive, overturned root. Vaelith sat down heavily, resting the iron staff across his knees. Valka sat beside him, their shoulders pressed tightly together. The screams of the monsters echoed louder now. The ground vibrated faintly beneath their boots. They were getting closer. Vaelith reached out to wipe the dirt from Valka's cheek. As he pulled his hand back, a sharp, jagged splinter from the tree root caught the side of his palm. It tore the skin. Vaelith stopped. He brought his hand up, staring at the fresh red line. A drop of blood welled up. It slowly ran down his wrist, completely ignoring the laws of divine regeneration. The wound stayed open. It stung sharply in the cold air. Vaelith let out a quiet breath. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It hurts, he whispered. Valka looked at the blood, then up at his exhausted face. It's going to leave a scar. Good. He lowered his hand, his fingers lacing tightly through hers. I will get sick, I will grow old, and eventually I will die. Yes, Valka said softly. You will. She lifted his injured hand and pressed it gently against her chest, right over the heavy, steady rhythm of her heart. Vaelith closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the damp wood. He listened to her heartbeat, ignoring the terrifying roars of the beasts tearing through the tree line just a few miles away. They had each other, and tomorrow they would probably die. The air was freezing, but Vaelith finally felt warm.